In its counteroffensive, Ukraine faces a dilemma between the two strategies of war defined by Karl von Clausewitz. It must choose between attrition and annihilation. It can either wear down the Russians, or it can try to destroy them. Ukraine has used both of these strategies to effect before, in Kherson for attrition and in Kharkiv for annihilation. By looking at the case of the Ukraine war, we can better understand these two strategies and why one might be used over another in a given situation. The strategy of attrition is associated with positional warfare. Positional warfare is somewhat self-explanatory, in that it involves the use of advantageous positions to inflict disproportionate losses on an enemy. Ukraine demonstrated this in Kherson, where it used the fact that the Russians were on the western bank of the Dnipro River to inflict disproportionate losses on them. The fact that all of Russia's supplies had to come across a major river held in a hostile country, and within range of HIMARS rockets, meant that the troops on the western bank of the Dnipro were in a position that was fundamentally unsustainable. Ukraine attacked their supply lines and attacked the troops themselves, and thereby attrited them and wore them down, until the Russians had to choose between suffering further losses and abandoning the territory it held on the western bank. The Russians chose to abandon the territory and a significant amount of equipment that Ukraine then captured, as well as liberating the city of Kherson itself. This is a prime example of positional warfare, where the exposed position of the Russians and the advantageous position of the Ukrainians were able to be leveraged, particularly via long-ranged fires from systems such as the HIMARS, to make the occupation of a particular position unsustainable. The objective of positional warfare is to force on the enemy the exact kind of dilemma that was forced on the Russians, to choose between sustaining disproportionate losses and between abandoning that position. So the Russians had to choose between suffering more casualties than they were inflicting on the Ukrainians, and thus becoming weaker, or giving up Kherson and the territory that they had captured. The strategy of annihilation works on a different principle. It is far less concerned with geography, and more concerned with maneuver. Maneuver warfare is the concept of using speed and rapidity of action to maintain the initiative and force the enemy continually into dilemmas of your own making. What this means is that, well, Kherson was a dilemma created by the geography working in concert with Ukrainian exploitation of that fact. Annihilation uses mobility itself as a weapon. The way this works is that a force will penetrate the front line and then proceed to conduct deep exploitation operations, moving into the rear, threatening the supply lines, the headquarters, everything that's important to the frontline troops, and bypassing them. This creates the threat of encirclement, where a force on the front line being caught with an enemy force in their rear will become completely cut off and isolated, unable to be supplied, and essentially wither on the vine, having no choice, surrender, or being destroyed by a surrounding force. The approach of annihilation is very attractive for a number of reasons. The first is simply that it can promise very swift victories. This is what Ukraine saw in Kharkiv, where depleted Russian forces in the north of the country allowed swift advances, penetrations in the front line that were then exploited and caused a collapse in the front line, as Russian troops rushed to retreat and prevent themselves from becoming encircled. Russia suffered numerous losses, and huge amounts of equipment were captured by the Ukrainians, as well as vast swaths of territory to an extent that has not been seen at any other point in the war. But the modern concept of maneuver warfare comes particularly from the Second World War. During the Battle of France, Nazi Germany succeeded in sending a force of tanks through the Ardennes forest, which then pressed to the coast of the English Channel in a very short period of time. This cut off Anglo-French forces in the Low Countries, and essentially forced the collapse of France. In a matter of weeks, one of the great powers of Europe had been brought to its knees. As a result, maneuver warfare has been the pinnacle of military excellence in Western military thought. The use of speed and maneuver to force the enemy into a position in which it must surrender or be destroyed is considered the highest form of excellence. Positional warfare, despite the fact it cannot promise the kind of dazzling and momentous victories of maneuver warfare, is less risky. When attempting to conduct maneuver warfare, there is a very real possibility that the force that is breaking through the front line and attempting exploitation of the enemy's rear areas can itself be encircled and presented with the dilemma that it seeks to enforce on the enemy. Successful maneuver warfare relies on use of combined arms and a maintenance of superior tempo of operations to the enemy. When conducting mobile operations, the attacking force has to consistently maintain the initiative, or else it is in a very dangerous and precarious position in which it may be easily cut off and destroyed. By contrast, in a positional offensive, the attacker may well prepare most steps of the offensive, having pre-planned artillery fires and never placing itself in a position extreme precarity where it may be destroyed. The slower pace of an offensive based on attrition and positional warfare provides the attacker with a lot more opportunities to abort or adjust if unexpected difficulties are encountered, or if the enemy attempts a counteroffensive of its own. In the case of Ukraine specifically, maneuver warfare presents a challenge. As a recent article published in War on the Rocks by Eric Kramer and Paul Schneider noted, Ukraine is struggling with a number of factors. For one, it's struggling to integrate the diverse array of equipment it fields. It's inherited a lot of Soviet stocks, it's captured a lot of Russian equipment that's been put back into service, and it's been donated equipment from essentially most Western countries. This presents a challenge in maintaining these vehicles and keeping them operational, and this presents a particular challenge if Ukraine attempts a strategy of annihilation. Maneuver warfare requires deep penetrations and operating behind the front lines. A relatively high rate of losses is inevitable in offensive operations, which means these sustainment problems, the difficulty in ensuring that a vehicle from France or a vehicle from Germany has the correct parts available when it's several kilometers behind the Russian front line and has a track missing, is a particular damper on the ability of Ukraine to sustain and maintain the tempo and initiative it needs to conduct successful mobile operations. As well, it's been noted that the Ukrainians have had difficulty in successfully integrating the various arms of its armed forces into successful combined armed operations. This is particularly important when conducting maneuver warfare. Combined arms is essential in all operations, but particularly so in mobile operations. The ability of the advancing element to coordinate with fire support especially is essential to ensuring that it can maintain the advance. The attack can only go forward when the attacker is effectively suppressing the defense, and the defender has a tactical advantage when it comes to fighting. The defender is fighting on known ground from usually pre-prepared fighting positions, particularly in the case of this Ukrainian counteroffensive. What this means is that the attackers need to do combined arms better than the defenders, and they need to do it with greater quantities than the defenders to effectively suppress the defenders and advance. Combined arms principally requires effective communication between the various branches. Infantry must talk to artillery, must talk to air support, and must talk to armor, and they must all talk to each other. This is the only way that they can act effectively and in concert to mutually support and inflict the suppression and losses on the enemy needed to constitute a mobile advance. It's not at all surprising that Ukraine is having difficulties in this regard. Combined operations, particularly to the extent needed for mobile warfare, are exceedingly difficult. Ukraine is in a position of particular difficulty when it comes to this because of the rapid expansion of the armed forces at the outbreak of the war. It's not a small professional military. It's the kind of military that is the product of a people in arms. What this means is that it has not had the same opportunities for training for a lot of its members that other Western militaries have had. As well, the West, in its successful applications of combined arms in the Gulf Wars, have relied on air supremacy, something that Ukraine does not have. In both the 1991 Gulf War and the 2003 invasion of Iraq, when advancing coalition elements met enemy points of resistance, they had the opportunity to simply call in air assets to put large amounts of explosives directly on target, using superior optics in an essentially uncontested airspace. Ukraine is pretty far from that. Ukraine does not have the luxury of air supremacy or air superiority. It barely has air parity. In fact, the Ukrainian Air Force has done remarkably well simply to prevent the Russians from gaining air superiority. Air parity is generally not a very good condition to be attempting to launch mobile operations from. Mobile operations are particularly reliant on air power, in that artillery is generally not capable of advancing fast enough to keep up with an armored advance. So, very quickly, an advance will find itself moving outside the range of artillery support. This creates the problem where the attackers are then unable to bring in artillery to suppress defenders, whereas the defenders are able to bring artillery onto the attackers and stall the advance. And if mobile operations become stalled, it creates the conditions for the attacking force to become cut off because of the salient that is formed when the front line is breached and exploited. Thus, attempting mobile operations without air superiority is incredibly risky and creates the opportunity for the attacking force to itself be annihilated. The third and final point made in the War on the Rocks article regarding Ukraine's deficiencies are problems with low-level leadership. Ukraine both lacks a robust non-commissioned officer corps and does not have a tradition of providing junior officers with extensive authority and initiative. These are both issues that are a legacy of the Soviet system. The Soviets placed emphasis on centralized leadership, where orders were expected to be passed up and down the chain of command with high frequency, and did not have a non-commissioned officer corps in a way that would be recognizable or comparable to Western systems. This makes Ukraine especially unconducive to maneuver warfare, as maneuver warfare requires junior officers to be able to make snap judgments regarding the correct position for exploitation. They must move faster and decide faster than the enemy, which is impossible if every order must be passed up and down the chain of command before it can be executed. Maneuver warfare requires the officers on the scene, on the front lines, to have the authority needed to continue an attack or to change the direction of attack in order to maintain mobility and to exploit the offensive. Based off of what is reported in this article, Ukraine has difficulties with that at this point. To some extent, we can expect this to be ameliorated by Western training, but Ukraine still has a very long legacy of the Soviet style of command. However, it's worth remembering that Ukraine has, in fact, performed successful mobile operations. At Kharkiv, Ukraine broke through the Russian line and exploited this breakthrough to cause a collapse in the Russian lines. The Russians were forced to withdraw from hundreds of square kilometers of Ukrainian soil and had to abandon a vast amount of equipment and had significant numbers killed, wounded, or captured. This was an ad hoc offensive carried out in significant part with Humvees and MRAPs, light armored vehicles that would not typically be used for these kind of operations. At the moment, Ukraine's counteroffensive is based around a nucleus of Western armor, main battle tanks, and infantry fighting vehicles, much heavier equipment and much more suitable for mobile operations than the barely armored vehicles they used at Kharkiv. While the Russians are better prepared and more dug in, Ukraine both has more experience and more preparation when it comes to its offensive. It has proven that it is capable of mobile operations. And while they are a risk, the fact that Ukraine is capable and the high rewards of successful mobile operations suggest that Ukraine may attempt them. Despite the number of deficiencies that Ukraine has, they're not fighting against a perfect opponent. While the Ukrainian army is not in an ideal position to conduct maneuver warfare, it must be remembered that the Russians are also not in an ideal position to resist maneuver warfare. The same problems identified in the War on the Rocks article as affecting the Ukrainian army affect the Russians tenfold. This is particularly the case because Russia is conducting an imperial war and suffers from a far higher degree of endemic corruption than Ukraine does. As well, Russia does not have any Western-trained officers or Western expertise to rely upon. The reason for the predominance of the concept of maneuver warfare in Western military thinking is not just because of how appealing its success is, but also because competence in maneuver warfare is required to resist it. The French in 1940 were unable to resist German maneuver warfare, particularly because their army was entirely oriented towards positional and attritional warfare. Of particular significance was the fact that France's army was heavily centralized. This centralization is a critical weakness in resisting maneuver warfare. Resisting maneuver warfare relies on junior officers on the defending side having sufficient authority and initiative to swiftly counterattack against the point in which the front line is breached and immediately make an effort to both contain the exploiting force and to cut it off. In a highly centralized system, junior officers do not have these qualities and are therefore poorly equipped to contain an enemy attempt at maneuver warfare. The Russians have a further disadvantage in resisting maneuver war. The corruption that afflicts every part of Russian society has not in any sense spared the army. In particular, what this means is that reports of junior officers are not trusted by their superiors, which is a particularly dangerous prospect when it comes to reacting quickly to a breach in the line. The Russians cannot quickly react to a Ukrainian breach in the line, which gives the Ukrainians ample time to exploit that breach, because reporting of that breach will not initially be believed as it passes up the chain of command. There is an incentive for the corrupt individuals in it to deflect blame, to minimize, and to otherwise veil the reality. The fact that this is pervasive and well known also means that if accurate reports of a Ukrainian breach of the line do reach the higher echelons of Russian command, they will not be initially believed, because they may be dismissed as another self-serving lie. As such, corruption destroys trust within any institution, and that is particularly true of an army. The Russian military is therefore very poorly equipped to respond and to maintain the initiative or to seize it back from the Ukrainians because of the low degree of trust within it and because of the low level of authority delegated to officers because of this lack of trust. As a result, Ukraine has several incentives to attempt maneuver warfare against the Russians. Maneuver warfare can promise a faster victory. A victory through annihilation is less costly than one won through attrition, and the Russians are themselves poorly equipped to dealing with breakthroughs in the line and exploitation of the rear areas, as was seen in the Kharkiv offensive. Ukraine will not abstain from using positional warfare when clear opportunities, such as the Russian position on the far side of the Dnipro River by Kherson, occur. But when given a choice, when Ukraine has to choose between placing its resources towards creating a beneficial positional situation or between directly using maneuver to annihilate Russian forces and attempt to create a collapse in the front line, Ukraine has stronger incentives to aim towards the latter. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, you can click here for more videos and subscribe for more content like this.